Machiavelli is important partly because he's just so well known and so many people have talked about him. I think anyone who wants to participate in the larger cultural conversations out there needs to know the term Machiavellian and what's meant by it. And of course, what it means is having the nature of or being like the things that Machiavelli recommended. He's kind of strong medicine, which is part of the reason he's been so controversial. And I'm not presenting him to you because I agree with him or because you need to agree with him, but I think he does, dealing with him seriously, forces us to think about things that really we should be thinking about. One of the things I said earlier about Machiavelli is that he's maybe the beginning of the modernist tradition. Well, in what way is the modernist tradition different than the ancients, the classics? And that's part of what I hope you see during this week's attention to Machiavelli. We've talked about, in addition to Socrates and Plato, we've talked about some of the Native American people, the way they approach things. And I would say what they are emphasizing is the role that spirit and spirituality plays in their thinking, that the world isn't simply matter and simply things. There's something in the background, something larger that is unifying things and making sense of things. That point of view is part of what Machiavelli, he isn't so much rejecting it as he is ignoring it. He's not very interested in what we know by abstract reasoning or what we know by experience of the divine or of revelation. That's not what he's paying attention to. I want to start by putting Machiavelli in a little bit of context. The context of his times, what it was like in Renaissance Florence in the early 1500s, and in the context of the other philosophers that we've talked about in this class so far, the classics, the ancients. That would be Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle primarily. Socrates, this is a typical thing, kind of thing that Socrates would say. A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether he is doing anything, whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong. Note the words ought in there. Ought, what we should do, the way we ought to behave is all over in Socrates. Ethics and morality were the only thing that Socrates really used philosophy to examine. And ethics and morality are usually concerned with prescriptive or normative statements about what we should do. You might note that in the modern world, scientists avoid the word ought. They talk about is. The 19th century Scottish philosopher David Hume talked about what he called the is-ought problem. It arises when a writer makes claims about what ought to be that are based on statements about what is. Hume found that there is a significant difference between statements about what is and prescriptive or normative statements about what ought to be. And one way of understanding Machiavelli is to note that he plays down thoughts about what we ought to do, that is morality, to focus on what is, that is facts drawn from the real world, which he studies through history. Now, that's not as easy as it might sound, getting rid of the ought and focusing on what is. Much of our thinking about what's right and wrong is emotional, and it's deeply emotional. It's hardwired into us. We have strong feelings that seem to be hardwired into the way we approach things. When I teach The Crucible, which is a play about the Salem witch trials, There are moments when truly bad people use their lives to destroy the lives of good people, innocent people who get arrested and drug away and hanged. And at some point, when the good people that we've been identifying with through the story, we see that they are in serious trouble because people are lying about them and pointing fingers at them. I stopped the film and asked students what emotion they're feeling. And I've done this in many classes, and always, no matter what political or religious background people have, they give the same answer: anger. It's making them mad. And that's a universal human response to seeing evil committed against innocent people. It doesn't really matter what time or place or culture people live in. If they see a big, ugly thug hit an innocent child on the head with a club or a baseball bat, they instinctively feel anger. Thus, justice, our sense of what people ought to do, is an emotion that we all feel before it becomes a philosophy. Human nature is real, and we really do want people to act the way they want to act. Um, I think one of the first phrases 2 or 3 year olds learn to utter in whatever language or culture they speak. I mean, if mom cuts a piece of cake into two pieces, one great big one and one little tiny one, and gives each of the two kids one of those pieces, I think it's universal that the kid who gets the little piece is going to cry out, "That's not fair. It isn't just." We all have a sense there are things people ought to do and things they ought not to do. And it upsets us when people don't do what they ought to do. So following Machiavelli and getting rid of learning what he said not to be good, it isn't actually that simple of a thing, and it's far from universal that people think he's right, although he makes a compelling argument. Aristotle takes moral reasoning in a different direction. He talks less about justice and more about happiness. And he makes the point that without sufficient intelligence or education, a person following only his emotions, only his feelings, is likely to think that what is pleasant is good and what is painful is evil. But Aristotle takes pains to show us that pleasure and pain can be misleading guides to what we ought to do. He does this by talking about happiness and making it clear that happiness is not the same thing as pleasure. We may judge a donut to be a good thing because it gives us pleasure, and we can't, in the moment we are eating it, perceive that it's contributing to our teeth rotting or our body getting fatter or our endocrine system being overloaded with sugar in ways that eventually lead to obesity and diabetes. It's with our intellect, not our senses. With our intellect, we can know the truth of such things. And so understanding that eating an apple, which contains many nutrients our bodies need, as well as the fiber that our intestines need to stay healthy, is more likely than eating a donut to contribute to our happiness. And here's a typical quote from Aristotle, from the Nicomachean Ethics. Thus, what seems good to a man of high moral standards is truly the object of wish, i.e., what seems good to him is in reality the good that ought to be wished. Whereas a worthless man, note you've got two kinds of people here, people of high moral standards and worthless people. A worthless man wishes anything that strikes his fancy. A man whose standards are high judges correctly, and in each case, what is good, truly good, will appear to him to be so. So you're getting this idea of reality, that something is real and some things are not real, and the intelligent person will respond to reality. out of this ability to see the truth in each moral question, since he is, as it were, the standard and measure for such questions. The common run of people, however, are misled by pleasure. For though it is not the good it seems to be, so they choose the pleasant in the belief that this is good and avoid pain, thinking that it is evil. And what I want you to notice here more is the way that Socrates uses reason to reach his conclusions, what counts as evidence. And what he's doing to a great extent is just relying on logic and asking you to think sort of theoretically about various situations. The great philosophers in ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and others, they helped create the world that was Europe, the world that Machiavelli was born into. And they did it based on moral reason. Socrates argues that we must act justly to avoid harming our own souls, which is the only harm that truly matters. And Aristotle argues that we must act virtuously because that is the path to happiness. The ancient philosophers talked about good and bad, justice and injustice, virtue and vice. And European civilization is just full of preoccupations with those issues. Socrates believed that no particular tree is perfect, but by examining trees and learning of their telos, their purpose, we could intellectually construct in our imaginations the perfect tree. We could define it, but we can't see a definition. What we perceive with our senses is a flawed and imperfect reflection of reality. The ideal world that is in the background that we can perceive only through our intellect. Reality can only be perceived with the intellect, he argued. And that's the main point of his famous allegory of the cave. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. It's only 2 or 3 pages. And like knowing what Machiavelli is, knowing about Plato's allegory of the cave is just part of the basic intellectual one of the basic pieces of intellectual furniture that you sort of need to understand some of what's going on around you. And those ancient Greek philosophers, what they were saying was quite compatible in many ways with Christianity. There's some huge differences between like Socrates and Jesus, for sure, but that preoccupation with there being a better world and that with the idea that what we're supposed to do is to figure out how we ought to act, there's a lot of overlap. The Christians say this fallen world is always corrupted, but we can learn the rules of the kingdom of heaven and begin living by those rules here and now, even if everyone else isn't. And it's by choosing to live by those higher rules in a world that isn't obeying them that accounts for progress, that accounts for this tarnished world moving gradually towards perfection. It was primarily Christians who, reading the Bible and thinking about it, reached the conclusion, the moral conclusion, that slavery could not be defended. If you were supposed to honor your mother and cleave to your spouse and observe the Sabbath, well, slaves might not be able to do any of those things, but it was clearly God's will that everyone do those things. Therefore, slavery had to be contrary to God's designs for the world, God's intentions for this world. And Jesus, like Socrates, was executed by the authorities because both men turned people's attention away from the corrupted world, which was controlled by powerful men who were often not good people, and toward a better world, which could be perceived through the power of imagination. The world that's here now can't establish justice perfectly, but there will be perfection in the next world. Plato's masterpiece is the Republic, which creates and examines an imaginary nation, searching for the ideal rules by which humans should govern themselves. The main cultural sources of European civilization are Greece and Jerusalem, Socrates and Jesus. And the world that Machiavelli was born into had a rich heritage of thought about morality and justice, which many understood to be the main purpose of human life, to learn what is good and to choose it. All of that is dismissed to a great extent by Machiavelli. He doesn't have any interest in imaginary nations or some next life that no one has actually seen. He's interested in power and in effective action in this world. And one seeking power needs to learn not how to be good, he claims. That's not the point. Here and now, what works? What's effective? Where can we find the answer? The real source of truth about how the world really works, Machiavelli concluded, was history. Moral philosophy deals with ought, but much of history deals with is. And it's important to really kind of not to dismiss Machiavelli too lightly or to give him his due. He grew up in a European world ordered. He didn't grow up in a European world ordered by love and peace and justice. His experience was of a city that was violent and chaotic. Renaissance Florence was subject to extreme political instability. And what that means in practice is assassinations, coups, torture, terror, and no prince could get control of things. You'd get a new prince and he would execute the people who were opposing him, often torture them, often gruesome executions in public to instill fear in people and teach a lesson. But he couldn't hang on to power, and 6 months later, he was being destroyed and tortured by enemies. And the church at the time was often not above the politics of war. It was part of it. And war, more taxes, famines, unemployment, epidemics. Politics was waged by terror, murder, bloodshed, coup after coup after coup, accompanied by torture, execution. At one point, two enemies accused of crimes were hanged together from a window over the street. So they were dangling down there and they were given knives so that to survive for a few minutes more, each had to try to kill the other who was trying to kill him. And below on the street, the crowd was yelling and cheering as the two struggling men hacked and stabbed at each other in a bloody mess of final anguish. This was the world. And keep in mind, I mean, you already know this, but although he didn't get tortured, and well, he did get tortured, but he didn't get executed. But Machiavelli was a victim of this sort of thing. A change, things were going well for him, and then the power regime changed, and he was no longer friends of the people in power. He was tortured and imprisoned, and then exiled. It's very understandable that Machiavelli found that thinking about how to establish political order, how to get stability, in other words, how can a prince get power, and more importantly, how can he keep it? Can we stop this endless cycle of coup and counter coup, assassination? There could be no order or justice in the world unless a ruler first gained and then held on to power. It doesn't matter how high-minded you are if you don't have any power. One needed to study power, Machiavelli thought, before his thoughts about justice would make a bit of difference. And so Machiavelli studied power. Well, how do you study power? Where do you go to do that? What Socrates concluded was that to study power, you needed to study history. Just as scientists try to ignore the folklore about how the world works, they weren't just interested in stories of gods and all of that, but they sought answers by observing carefully what actually does happen in the world. Does a heavy object fall faster than a light object? Well, you could go off and think theoretically about why it might be one or the other, but the scientific way to answer the question is simply to drop a heavy object and a light object and to time their fall. The scientific method, which is concerned not with what ought to be, but what is, moves forward mainly by observation. In human affairs, not the world of falling objects, but the world of rule and being ruled, in the world of gaining and using power to govern a kingdom, history is the record we have of what actually happened. To people who are inclined to ignore revelation, history is all we know. Machiavelli somewhat invents the idea of effectiveness. It's a popular word now, but it's a popular word partly because of the influence of Machiavelli. The word effective is related to the word fact. And Machiavelli is not interested in religious or philosophical imaginings of what the world could be. He's interested in how the world of our immediate experience actually works. And the way to see that is to observe history, the factual record of what has actually happened, what have people done, and what consequences followed. And so what I want you to notice when you're reading Machiavelli is, I'd ask, how does Aristotle develop his argument? What counts as evidence in the world as Aristotle understands it? And you can contrast the way Aristotle wrote, what he uses to prove his case with what Machiavelli does. This is a typical passage from Machiavelli. People thought that Caesar Borgia was cruel, but that cruelty of his was reorganized by Romagna, united it and established it in peace and loyalty. Anyone who views the matter realistically, note the words that Machiavelli is emphasizing, realism. Anyone who views the matter realistically will see that this prince was much more merciful than the people of Florence, who, to avoid the reputation of cruelty, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed. Thus, no prince should mind being called cruel for what he does to keep his subjects united and loyal. He may make examples of a very few, but he will be more merciful in reality than those who in their tender-heartedness allow disorders to occur with their attendant murders and lootings. A couple of things I'd like you to notice about this passage, the kind of thing you'll see all through reading him, is, first of all, it's not really the case that he isn't concerned at all with good and bad. He's just thinking the larger good. It's a bad thing when a city or a nation is in a constant state of violence and civil war and assassinations. That's not good. It's not good for anybody. It's better if it can be orderly. And so his argument is that the king, the prince, may need to ignore morality in order to prevail in a world which is full of bad people trying to destroy each other. You may need to be bad to survive, but you're not doing that. You're not necessarily doing that just out of pure selfishness. It may be the case that you're doing it out of a desire to make the world a better place for people. So what I'm going to leave you with is the question that is still being argued today. in many places. Was Machiavelli right? Was his focus on power to the exclusion of right and wrong really defensible? It's a big question, and that one that stayed controversial through the centuries. It's a question that doesn't, a simple yes or no doesn't seem like a satisfying answer. People always want to explain, well, why he was right, why Machiavelli was on the right track, or why he was wrong, why Machiavelli's a bad influence and we should not follow him. And today, what we inherit from Machiavelli is a great conversation that's gone on in many nations, among many people for centuries. And so think of this as kind of an invitation to join that conversation. We know that we live in a corrupted world where there are lots of bad people who do bad things. The question is, what's the correct way for us to live in that kind of world? In Schoology, I've asked two questions that I would like you to take the time to wrestle with. Wrestle intellectually, putting your position into words. Don't just say I agree or I disagree, but explain what basis there is for the position that you take. Question one, are there some actions that are wrong always and everywhere that we should never commit? Murder would be the usual example. Is it true that we should, and keep in mind that murder doesn't just mean the same thing as killing people. I mean, there are lots of examples of humans killing each other that are not considered murder. The main example probably would be a soldier in war who kills the enemy. That people don't generally define that as murder. Murder is an illegal killing, one that's against the law. And generally what that means is it's the killing of someone who is innocent. So are there rules? Are there really moral laws in the universe that tell us there are some things we should never ever do? And then a related but different question is, does the end justifies the means? Is that a defensible moral position? In other words, what I'm doing, the means right now may be bad or evil, but I'm doing it so that I can accomplish something good. Can you really defend that? Or like Thomas Aquinas said that you should never lie. That was a categorical imperative for him. Never tell a lie. But is that true? I mean, the favorite philosopher question is, well, suppose that you're in Germany in 1938 and you're hiding Jews in your basement, and the Gestapo knocks at your door and asks you the question, are there any Jews in this house? Would it be morally okay to lie? Aquinas would say no. There we are. I hope this helps a little with the reading of Machiavelli, and we'll see you next time.